There are places built to last, and places built to be left behind. Sometimes a man cannot tell the difference until history makes the choice for him. Stuttgart, 1931. The house stands on Feuerbacher Weg, quiet and modern, set back from the street. White stucco walls, clean geometric lines, large windows that invite light without excess. A residence designed by an engineer, not an architect. Functional elegance without pretense. Inside, there are drafting tables, technical drawings scattered across surfaces, the faint smell of motor oil that no amount of cleaning ever quite removes. This is not a palace. It is a workshop disguised as a home, where Ferdinand Porsche brings his work to the dinner table, and his family learns to speak in the language of crankshafts and compression ratios. If you value deep investigations into engineering dynasties and the homes where their legacies were forged, consider subscribing. We're building toward our first 1,000, and your support allows these stories to be told with the care they deserve. Ferdinand is 56. Stocky build, thinning hair combed back, spectacles that slip down his nose when he leans over his sketches. He speaks with a thick Austrian accent, mixing German with technical terms he borrows from wherever he finds them. His hands are broad and scarred from decades of prototype work. He does not look like the kind of man who designs race cars. He looks like someone's uncle who happens to reshape the future of automotive engineering between breakfast and lunch. The residence itself reflects this duality. Downstairs, a proper sitting room, modest dining area, kitchen where his wife Louise oversees meals with Viennese precision. Upstairs, bedrooms for the children, a study that has become a second office, shelves weighted with technical manuals in 4 languages, and then the space that matters most, a converted garage where Porsche spends evenings refining designs that will soon bear his name on contracts across Europe. The Volkswagen project is still theoretical. The Type 64 is years away. Right now, there are consultancy agreements, freelance engineering work, conversations with manufacturers who want his expertise but not always his vision. The family adapts. His son Ferry, 22, already shows the genetic inheritance, a mind that sees problems as puzzles to be disassembled and improved. His daughter Louise, called Louisa to avoid confusion with her mother, manages the household's administrative chaos with the efficiency her father applies to engine design. They live suspended between 2 worlds, the respectable domesticity of a Stuttgart neighborhood and the relentless forward motion of a man who cannot stop working even when there is no immediate client, no pressing deadline, only the compulsion to make things better than they were. Outside, Germany is changing. The elections of 1930 shifted the political landscape. The streets carry new tensions. But here, in this house on Feuerbacher Weg, there is still a kind of insulation. Engineering is neutral. Innovation serves whoever can afford it. Porsche works with Austrian firms, German manufacturers, Italian racing teams. His reputation is technical, not political. He designs what works, regardless of who signs the contract. The drawings on his desk show a small car, affordable, efficient, something the average family might actually drive. It is an old obsession of his, dating back to his days at Austro-Daimler. Make something simple, make it reliable, make it for everyone, not just the wealthy. The specifications are meticulous: air-cooled rear engine, lightweight construction, ease of maintenance. It is idealistic in the way only an engineer's ideal can be, born from calculations, not sentiment. But ideals require funding, and funding in 1931 requires navigating powers that are beginning to consolidate. The house is quiet. The work continues. And outside the gates, history is deciding what it will do with private dreams. Ferdinand Porsche did not inherit his career. He built it from apprenticeship wages and patent disputes, from race victories and midnight sketches, from the stubborn belief that machines could be made better if someone would just let him work. Born 1875, Maffersdorf, Bohemia. His father ran a plumbing business. Ferdinand showed no interest in pipes. He showed interest in electricity, mechanics, anything that moved or could be made to move. At 16, he left for Vienna, enrolled in technical school at night, worked at Baylor Egger & Co.'s during the day. By 20, he was designing electric motors. By 25, he had built a hybrid gasoline-electric vehicle that should not have worked as well as it did, the Lohner Porsche 1900. It won him attention. Attention became opportunity. Austro-Daimler hired him in 1906, technical director by 1916. 15 years of designing engines that won races and cars that competed with the best Europe offered. He was good at the work. He was difficult with management. He had opinions about how things should be done and insufficient patience for committees who wanted feasibility studies before innovation. By 1923, the relationship had soured. He moved to Daimler-Benz in Stuttgart. Technical director again, larger budget, more prestige. And the same problem: brilliant engineer, poor politician. He wanted to build what made sense. The board wanted to build what sold. They were not always the same thing. 1928, he designed the Mercedes SSK, supercharged, powerful, dominant on racing circuits. It should have been his triumph. Instead, it became his exit. Creative differences, the official statement said. What it meant: Ferdinand Porsche could design anything, but could not navigate boardroom consensus. In 1930, at 55, he left Daimler-Benz without another position secured. Not fired exactly, not resigned exactly, simply finished with being managed. Stuttgart had become home by then. Louise and the children were settled. Ferry was studying engineering, absorbing his father's methods. Moving again seemed pointless. So Ferdinand made a different decision. He opened his own consulting bureau. Porsche Engineering, April 1931. A small office downtown, a few trusted colleagues, and the freedom to work for whoever would pay. No board, no committees, just contracts and deadlines, and the possibility of designing what he actually wanted to design. The residence on Feuerbacher Weg came shortly after. Not a statement of wealth. Porsche had savings, but not fortune. A practical decision. Space for the family, proximity to the office, and crucially, room for a workshop. The house was purchased, not built, an existing structure that suited their needs without requiring architectural ambition. Solid construction, unremarkable exterior, and that garage that could be converted into something useful. Louise ran the household with the same efficiency she had brought from Vienna. Meals at fixed hours, cleanliness maintained, a space where Ferdinand could work without chaos intruding. She understood what she had married, a mind that never stopped, that woke at 3 in the morning with solutions and needed paper immediately. The house accommodated this, quiet enough for concentration, close enough to clients that meetings did not consume entire days in travel. Ferry and Louisa adapted to their father's rhythms. Dinner conversations became design critiques. Weekends involved test drives and prototype evaluations. The family existed as an extension of the work, not separate from it. This was not coldness. It was integration. The Porsches did not distinguish between professional life and private life, because for Ferdinand there was only the work, and the family had learned to inhabit it alongside him. The consulting business grew quickly. Porsche's reputation preceded him. Manufacturers across Europe knew what he could deliver. Wanderer wanted a new car design. NSU needed engineering consultation. Izundab approached him about a prototype. The projects were diverse, technically complex, often contradictory in their requirements. Ferdinand accepted them all. Bills had to be paid, and between the commercial contracts, He kept returning to his own obsession: the small car, the people's car, affordable, practical, elegant in its simplicity. He worked alone on those sketches, late at night, after the paid work was complete. No client had commissioned it. No manufacturer had expressed interest. But the vision persisted: a vehicle that could be produced cheaply enough that ordinary families could own one. It was an engineer's fantasy: pure function, minimal waste, design serving purpose without ornament. The house became the vessel for this double life: consulting work that funded stability, personal projects that fed ambition, a family that understood both were necessary. And outside, beyond the ordered calm of Feuerbacher Weg, Germany was deciding what it would become. The elections were over. The Reichstag was shifting. New powers were consolidating. But inside the residence, Ferdinand Porsche drew his lines and calculated his ratios, and believed, as engineers often do, that technical excellence would be enough to navigate whatever was coming. History was about to test that belief. Between 1931 and 1933, the consulting business succeeded in ways Ferdinand had not anticipated. Contracts arrived steadily. Zündap commissioned a prototype small car, rear-mounted engine, streamlined body, the principles he had been refining for years. Then Auto Union came with a more ambitious project: a racing car to compete in the new Grand Prix formula. 16 cylinders, mid-engine placement, revolutionary suspension. The kind of technical challenge Porsche lived for. The residence on Feuerbacher Weg became operational headquarters. Clients visited for consultations. Prototypes were discussed over coffee in the sitting room. Ferry began working alongside his father officially, no longer just an apprentice, but a contributing engineer. The line between family home and design bureau dissolved completely. Drawings spread across every flat surface. Engine components appeared on the dining table. Louise stopped objecting. This was simply how they lived now. The work was good, technically demanding, adequately paid, creatively satisfying. Porsche had achieved what he wanted: independence without isolation, authority without bureaucracy. He answered to contracts, not committees. If a design worked, it proceeded. If it failed, he revised it. Simple mechanics. Then January 1933 arrived, and the mechanics of everything else stopped being simple. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th. The appointment was legal, procedural, the result of backroom negotiations and political miscalculation. Many assumed it would be temporary. A coalition government, constrained by traditional powers, limited by constitutional checks. This was the optimistic reading. The street suggested otherwise. Parades appeared. Uniforms multiplied. The rhetoric shifted from campaigning to consolidation. Ferdinand Porsche was not political. He had never been political. He voted when required, paid taxes, avoided public statements on governance. His nationality was Austrian, his residence German, his business pan-European. Borders were administrative details. Engineering was universal. This had always been sufficient. But the new government had specific interests: infrastructure, industry, rearmament, though that word was not yet used openly, and transportation. They wanted Germany mobile, motorized, competitive. They wanted what Ferdinand Porsche had spent his entire career learning how to build. The first approach came indirectly, an invitation to a meeting. The Reich Association of the German automobile industry wanted to discuss national transportation policy. Porsche attended. The room was full of familiar faces: manufacturers, designers, engineers he had worked with for decades, and new faces, party officials, men whose authority came from politics, not technical expertise. The conversation was ostensibly about industry standards. The subtext was about alignment. Porsche said little during the meeting. He listened, took notes, offered technical observations when asked. He did not volunteer opinions on policy. He had learned, over years of corporate conflicts, when to speak and when to let others fill silence. This was a room full of people determining how to let others fill silence while appearing collaborative. Weeks later, another invitation. This one more specific. A project the government wanted to commission. A people's car. Affordable, mass-produced, accessible to ordinary German families. The Volkswagen. It was Ferdinand's own vision, the sketches he had been drawing for years, now arriving as a state directive with funding attached. The irony was not lost on him. He had pitched this concept to private manufacturers repeatedly. They had all declined. Too risky, they said. Insufficient profit margins. The market did not exist. Now the market was being created by government mandate, and suddenly the impossible was not only possible, but compulsory. He accepted the commission. Of course he accepted. This was the work he wanted to do. The political context was secondary. Engineering was engineering. Design was design. He could build this car for the state as easily as he could have built it for Daimler-Benz or Auto Union. The client's ideology did not alter the technical requirements, but accepting meant something more than he acknowledged at the time. It meant alignment, implicit endorsement, participation in a system that was moving beyond administrative governance into something else. The house on Feuerbacher Weg remained unchanged. The work continued. The family adapted to the new contracts. And outside the gates, the forces that had been gathering were no longer gathering. They had arrived. They were inside the room. They were signing the checks. Ferdinand drew his lines and calculated his ratios and told himself that engineering was neutral, that excellence would protect him, that private dreams could survive even when history decided to fund them. The Volkswagen project began. The residents became busier. More meetings, more prototypes, more pressure. Ferry worked 18-hour days alongside his father. Louise managed the logistics of a household that now functioned as an extension of state industry. And the question that would echo through everything that followed began to form, though no one spoke it aloud yet. What happens when the dream you have been chasing arrives, but brings with it forces you never intended to serve? The residence became a controlled storm. 1934 through 1937, the busiest years Ferdinand Porsche would ever know. The Volkswagen prototypes required constant refinement. The Auto Union race cars dominated European circuits, silver arrows that rewrote the physics of speed. And every success generated more contracts, more meetings, more party officials arriving at Feuerbacher Weg to discuss projects that blurred the line between civilian innovation and military preparation. The household staff expanded. A secretary to manage correspondence, a draftsman to assist with technical drawings, a cook because Louise could no longer maintain meals, while the dining room functioned as a conference space. The house was too small for what it had become, but moving seemed impossible. Every room had been adapted to purpose. The converted garage held prototype components. The study overflowed with contracts in 3 languages. Ferry's bedroom doubled as an auxiliary office when deadlines compressed. Daily life followed industrial rhythms. Breakfast at 6. Ferdinand at his drafting table by 7. Client meetings mid-morning. Prototype evaluations in the afternoon. Evenings reserved for the work that was his alone. Refinements to the Volkswagen design. Adjustments that no contract specified, but that his sense of correctness demanded. He slept 5 hours if he was lucky. Louise stopped asking him to rest. Rest was not something he understood. The Auto Union victories brought prestige. Bernd Rosemeyer won race after race in cars Porsche had designed, 16 cylinders screaming through European countryside, lap records falling like dominoes. Each victory was a validation. Engineering working exactly as calculated. The Nazi regime celebrated these triumphs publicly, wrapped them in nationalist rhetoric, used them as proof of German superiority. Ferdinand attended the ceremonies when required. He shook hands. He accepted congratulations. He did not make speeches. He let the cars speak. But the Volkswagen project was different, more complicated, more compromised. The original vision, an affordable car for ordinary families, was being absorbed into something larger. The Strength Through Joy program, state-controlled savings plans, a vehicle that workers would pay for in advance through wage deductions, with delivery promised after the factory was built, after production began, after the infrastructure was established. Ferdinand focused on the engineering: air-cooled engine, torsion bar suspension, streamlined body for efficiency. The rest was politics. He told himself the rest was not his concern. The test track at Feuerbacher Weg saw constant use. Prototypes arrived, were evaluated, were sent back for modification. Ferry drove them, noted handling characteristics, reported problems his father corrected overnight. Father and son worked as a single unit now, thinking in parallel, finishing each other's technical sentences. They spoke less about politics than about compression ratios. This was intentional. Some subjects were safer left unexamined. Visitors increased, not just clients anymore. SS officers with engineering questions, party officials who wanted explanations of technical concepts they did not understand but needed to approve. Robert Ley from the Labour Front, interested in the Volkswagen's propaganda potential. Fritz Todt from the Construction Ministry, discussing infrastructure for mass motorization. These men arrived in uniform. They were polite. They were interested. They were impossible to refuse. Louise maintained composure. She served coffee. She made small talk about weather and traffic. She did not ask questions about who these people were or what they represented. The residence had become semi-public space. Privacy was something they remembered from earlier years, but no longer expected. The house belonged to the work. The work belonged increasingly to powers that did not explain themselves. The fractures were small at first. A letter from a former colleague who had emigrated to Britain, carefully worded, asking if Ferdinand had considered his position. He did not reply. A newspaper article about restrictions on Jewish engineers that made Ferry uncomfortable during dinner. The conversation moved to other topics. A quiet moment when Louise looked at her husband and seemed about to say something, then turned away. These were not crises. They were discomforts, easily ignored, easily rationalized. The money was good, better than any salary Porsche had earned in 30 years of employment. The contracts kept coming. The auto union cars kept winning. The Volkswagen prototypes improved with each iteration. By 1937, Ferdinand Porsche had achieved what every engineer dreams of: total creative control, adequate resources, and work that mattered. He had built the career he wanted. He had kept his family together. He had proven that independence was possible. What he had not done was ask who was paying for it, or why they were willing to pay so much, or what they expected in return beyond technical excellence. The residence stood clean and orderly on Feuerbacher Weg. Inside, the work continued. The drawings accumulated. The prototypes evolved. And the question that had been forming since 1933 began to solidify into something that could no longer be ignored. When history claims your private dream, does it remain yours? Or does it become something else entirely, wearing the shape of what you wanted, while serving purposes you never intended? Ferdinand did not ask this question aloud. He was too busy working. But the question was there, in the silent moments between meetings, in the uniforms that appeared at his door, in the victories that felt less like triumphs and more like obligations. The apex had been reached. What came next would not be a gentle descent. 1938 arrived with momentum that felt unstoppable. The Volkswagen factory was approved, groundbreaking scheduled for Fallersleben, a massive complex that would employ thousands and produce hundreds of thousands of cars annually. Ferdinand Porsche was named chief designer, a position that came with prestige, substantial compensation, and expectations that extended beyond engineering. He was no longer just a consultant. He was a state asset. His designs were national projects. His success was the Reich's success. The residence could not contain the scale anymore. A proper office building was leased in Stuttgart, closer to the city center, with space for a full engineering team. But Feuerbacher Weg remained the center. This was where Ferdinand preferred to work, where the atmosphere was still his own, or close enough to his own, that the distinction did not matter. The converted garage, the cluttered study, the dining table where problems were solved over cold dinner, these spaces held no bureaucracy, no official observation, no uniforms watching. Ferry was 29 now, fully integrated into the business, his name appearing on patents beside his father's. He had inherited the technical mind, but also something Ferdinand lacked: awareness of context. He noticed things. The increasing militarization of projects, the way conversations about civilian vehicles pivoted toward troop transport specifications, the engineers who quietly left Germany and were not replaced. Ferry said nothing. What was there to say? The work continued, the contracts paid, and questioning the client was not how one maintained a consulting business. The auto union cars evolved, more powerful, more refined, capable of speeds that seemed to defy reasonable limits. But the racing circuit was changing. The competition was no longer just about engineering excellence. It was about national demonstration. Each victory was reported as evidence of superiority, not just mechanical, but civilizational. Ferdinand attended the races when required, watched his designs dominate, and felt the discomfort of success that served purposes beyond itself. Louise noticed the change in her husband, not in his work. That remained obsessive, meticulous, unchanged, but in his silences. The way he no longer talked about future projects with the same enthusiasm. The way he accepted commissions without discussing them with the family first. She had been married to him for 33 years. She knew when he was avoiding something. She did not press. Pressing would require acknowledging what they were both avoiding. The Anschluss happened in March. Austria absorbed into Germany. Borders erased. Ferdinand's homeland now part of the Reich he worked for. The news came over the radio during dinner. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Ferry asked a technical question about carburetor modifications, and the conversation returned to safe ground. What was there to discuss? The fact was accomplished. Reaction was irrelevant. But the implications were not irrelevant. Porsche's Austrian nationality had provided a psychological buffer, a sense of separation from German politics. That buffer was gone. He was no longer a foreign consultant working in Germany. He was a German subject, working for a German state, designing for German purposes. The distinction was technical. The weight was real. November brought Kristallnacht. The violence was impossible to ignore, even from the insulated remove of Feuerbacher Weg. Broken glass in Stuttgart streets, synagogues burning, reports that filtered through despite official minimization. The Porsche household did not discuss it. There was an unspoken agreement that certain topics would not be brought to the dinner table. This was not callousness. It was survival. Acknowledge too much, and you must respond. Respond, and you jeopardize everything. Ferdinand continued working. This was his answer to discomfort. Work harder, focus tighter, let technical problems consume the space where moral questions might grow. The Volkswagen prototypes were nearly ready for mass production. The factory construction was ahead of schedule. The Type 64, a streamlined version intended for a Berlin to Rome race, was taking shape in the garage. These were accomplishments, measurable, concrete, the kind of success that could be quantified and verified. But late at night, alone in his study, Ferdinand sometimes looked at his drawings and asked himself what he was building. Not technically, he knew exactly what he was building, but for whom, and to what end. The Volkswagen was supposed to motorize Germany, make car ownership accessible, fulfill the vision he had carried for decades. Instead, it was becoming a propaganda tool, a savings scheme that collected workers' money for a product that had not yet been delivered, a promise wrapped in pageantry. The war began in September 1939. Poland invaded, conquered, partitioned. The news was delivered as triumph, swift victory, German efficiency, the natural result of superior organization. Ferdinand received new contracts almost immediately: military vehicles, modifications to existing designs for wartime production. The Volkswagen factory at Fallersleben would be retooled, not for civilian cars, for military equipment. The people's car indefinitely postponed. The dream converted into machinery for invasion. He signed the contracts. What else could he do? Refuse and lose everything. Refuse and risk detention. Refuse and watch competitors absorb the projects he had pioneered. This was the calculus of compromise. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Each decision was justifiable by circumstance. But the accumulation was something else. Something he was inside of now, too deep to extract himself even if he wanted to. Ferry understood what his father would not say. The work they were doing was no longer separate from the regime's purposes. It was integral to those purposes. They were not just engineers anymore. They were participants. Complicit not through enthusiasm, but through continuation, through the choice to keep working, when working meant serving. The residence still stood on Feuerbacher Weg, still looked the same from the street. White stucco, geometric lines, modest elegance. But inside, the atmosphere had changed. There was tension that had not existed before. Conversations that stopped when staff entered rooms. A watchfulness, as if the house itself might be listening. Louise managed the household with the same efficiency, but her face had hardened. She was older now, tired in ways that sleep did not address. Ferdinand was 64, the age when men consider retirement, reduced workload, time with family. Instead, he was more enmeshed than ever, projects multiplying, deadlines compressing, the regime's needs expanding to fill every available hour. He had achieved what he wanted and lost something he could not name. The independence he thought he had built was revealed as conditional, granted by powers that expected loyalty in return. The question was no longer theoretical. History had claimed his private dream. The Volkswagen bore his name, but served purposes he had not intended. The residence was still his home, but functioned as an extension of state industry. The work continued, excellent and precise, and utterly compromised. And there was no path back, only forward, into whatever came next, with the knowledge that excellence had not protected him. It had only made him more useful. The forces outside the gates were no longer outside. They were in the contracts he signed, the meetings he attended, the designs he refined for purposes he chose not to examine too closely. The dream was still his, but it belonged to history now. And history was not finished with what it intended to take. The war consumed everything. By 1941, the Volkswagen factory produced no civilian vehicles, only military equipment. Kübelwagens for troops, Schwimmwagens for amphibious operations, components for weapon systems. Ferdinand had not designed, but was expected to improve. The consulting business was no longer consulting. It was assignment. The regime determined priorities. Engineers executed them. Choice was a formality that pretended to exist. Ferdinand traveled constantly now, between Stuttgart and Fallersleben, between design bureaus and production facilities, between meetings with generals who wanted technical solutions to tactical problems. He was 70 years old and worked like a man half his age, driven by something beyond ambition or passion, momentum perhaps, or the fear of what stopping would mean. If you pause, you must look at what you have been doing. Better to keep moving. The residents saw him less. Days would pass when he did not return, sleeping instead in hotels near factories, reviewing production reports at 4 in the morning, traveling to the next meeting before breakfast. Louise managed alone. Ferry was often away as well, supervising projects across the expanding German territories. The house that had been too full was now too empty. Staff reduced, resources diverted to war production. The converted garage silent, no prototypes being tested, no late-night revisions to designs that would never be built. Louise was 63. She had spent her life managing the chaos her husband generated, translating his obsessions into functional domesticity, maintaining the infrastructure that allowed genius to operate. Now there was less to manage, but more to endure. The shortages, the bombings that began in 1942, air raid sirens splitting Stuttgart nights. The knowledge that her husband's work contributed to a machine that was consuming Europe. She said nothing. Saying anything would require confronting questions neither of them could answer. The turning point arrived not as a single moment, but as accumulated weight that finally exceeded what could be borne. 1944, the Reich collapsing inward, resources depleting, the certainty of defeat becoming undeniable to anyone not committed to delusion. Ferdinand was asked to design tanks, then asked to improve existing tank designs, then ordered to relocate operations eastward as Allied bombing intensified, each request more desperate than the last. Each order evidence that the system he had served was failing catastrophically. He tried to retreat into pure engineering, focus on technical problems, ignore strategic context. But the problems were increasingly impossible. Design vehicles without adequate steel, improve production without sufficient labor, meet deadlines while infrastructure crumbled. Excellence was no longer enough because excellence required resources that no longer existed. April 1945, Stuttgart fell to French forces. The residents on Feuerbacher Weg survived the bombing largely intact. Remarkable luck, or perhaps too insignificant a target to merit attention. Ferdinand was not there. He had been in Austria, at a facility outside Gmünd, when the Reich's final collapse came. Ferry was with him. Louise had remained in Stuttgart, too old and too exhausted to evacuate. The occupation began. French soldiers moved through the city, requisitioning properties, arresting officials, processing the administrative details of defeat. The Porsche residence was searched, documents confiscated, equipment catalogued. Louise answered questions with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that every word could be weaponized. Yes, this was Ferdinand Porsche's home. No, she did not know when he would return. Yes, he had worked for the regime. No, she could not explain the nature of that work. What came next was predictable in retrospect, unthinkable in the moment. Ferdinand and Ferry were arrested in December 1945. Collaboration charges, war crimes allegations. They had designed for the Reich. They had profited from forced labor at the Volkswagen factory. They had enabled military production. The technical excellence that had protected them for 15 years now became evidence of complicity. They were held in France, interrogated, processed through tribunals that were determining how to allocate guilt for a catastrophe that implicated millions. The residence stood empty, not abandoned. Louise returned after the initial occupation chaos subsided, but emptied of purpose. The converted garage held nothing. The study's shelves were bare, documents removed by French officials, cataloguing the evidence of Ferdinand's career. The house that had functioned as workshop, office, headquarters, was just a house again. Walls and rooms and silence. Louise lived there alone for nearly 2 years, while her husband and son remained imprisoned. She was not permitted to visit. Letters were restricted. Information arrived through intermediaries, legal representatives, rumors that might or might not be accurate. She waited because there was nothing else to do. The woman who had spent 4 decades managing a household organized around relentless productivity now had no productivity to manage, only absence. Ferry was released first, July 1947. The charges against him were reduced. He had been following his father's lead, the tribunals determined. Complicit, but not primarily culpable. He returned to Stuttgart, to the residence that felt like a relic from a previous life. Found his mother aged beyond the 2 years' separation, her hair entirely grey, her hands that had managed endless logistics now idle and uncertain. Ferdinand remained imprisoned until August 1947. 22 months total. He was 72 when he was released, diminished in ways that went beyond age. The man who had worked 18-hour days could barely manage a full afternoon. The mind that had held complex engineering systems in parallel could not follow conversations without losing track. Something had broken, not his body exactly. But the mechanism that had driven him forward for 7 decades had simply stopped. He returned to Feuerbacher Weg, saw the empty garage, the bare study, the house that had witnessed his apex, and now would witness whatever came after. Louise greeted him at the door. They did not embrace. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. They were familiar strangers, reunited by circumstance in a place that no longer meant what it once had. The residents could not support them. Ferdinand's assets had been seized, his business dismantled, his reputation irrevocably compromised. The house would have to be sold. The decision was practical, unemotional, the only option available. They would move to Austria, to Gmünd, where Ferry was attempting to rebuild something from the wreckage. A small operation, modest ambitions, nothing like what had been. The private dream had become history, and history had extracted its price. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in accumulated losses too numerous to catalogue. Ferdinand Porsche had designed the people's car, but the people had never received it. He had achieved independence, but lost himself in the service of powers he should have refused. He had kept his family together, only to watch them suffer the consequences of his choices. In 1950, they left Stuttgart permanently. The residence on Feuerbacher Weg was sold to pay debts and legal fees. The new owners were uninterested in its history. It was just a house. Solid construction, good location, reasonable price. They moved in and made it theirs, unaware or unconcerned that the rooms had once held the ambitions of a man who thought engineering could remain neutral, that excellence could protect, that private dreams could survive, even when history decided to claim them. Ferdinand would die in 1951, in Austria, far from the house where his career had peaked and then collapsed. The question that had echoed through everything remained unanswered. Or perhaps it had been answered, and the answer was simply this: when history claims your dream, it keeps it. What returns to you is only the shape of what you wanted, emptied of everything that made it yours. The residence on Feuerbacher Weg still stands. White stucco walls, geometric lines, large windows that invite light without excess. It has been renovated, modernized, adapted to contemporary standards. The converted garage is a garage again. The study where Ferdinand drew his lines is someone's home office. The dining table where the Volkswagen was refined over cold dinners has been replaced, probably several times. The house functions as a house, nothing more. There is no plaque, no historical marker. Stuttgart has other sites that claim Porsche's legacy. The museum in Zuffenhausen, the corporate headquarters, the factory where his name is manufactured onto vehicles that bear almost no resemblance to what he originally designed. The residence is private property. The current owners may know its history. More likely, they do not care. It is simply where they live. The Porsche family rebuilt. Ferry took the wreckage of his father's reputation and transformed it into something else entirely. The sports cars that emerged from Gmünd in the late 1940s carried the family name, but served a different vision. Not affordable transportation for everyone. Exclusive performance for those who could pay. The dream inverted. The people's car became the elite's toy. Perhaps this was the only honest outcome. History had claimed the original dream. What remained had to be something new. Ferdinand did not live to see the full resurrection. He died in January 1951, 75 years old, his final months spent in quiet diminishment. The man who had spent his life in motion was finally still. Louise survived him by 8 years, outliving the husband whose obsessions had shaped her entire adult life. She is buried beside him in Austria, far from Stuttgart, far from the house where their apex and collapse had unfolded. The Volkswagen eventually became what Ferdinand imagined, decades late, under different circumstances, built by a resurrected German state that needed to prove it had learned something from catastrophe. Millions produced, globally distributed. The Beetle, they called it, a nickname Ferdinand never used. His design, hollowed of its original context, refilled with nostalgia and marketing. The people's car, finally, but not his anymore. History's. The shape remained. The purpose had been rewritten. The question echoes still. What happens to a private dream when history decides to claim it? The residence on Feuerbacher Weg offers no answer. It simply stands, ordinary and unremarkable, on a quiet street in Stuttgart. Inside, people live their lives. They cook dinner, work from home, perhaps store a car in the garage that once held prototypes of vehicles that would reshape the 20th century. They do not think about Ferdinand Porsche. They have their own dreams, their own work, their own illusions of control. Stand outside the residence in evening light. The windows glow. The street is calm. There is nothing to indicate that this place once held ambitions that collided with history and shattered. That is the nature of houses. They outlive the people who inhabit them, absorb new purposes, forget what they witnessed. The walls remember nothing. The silence is complete. If you value investigations into the spaces where private ambition encounters forces beyond its control, consider subscribing and liking this work. Comment with suggestions for which estate or mansion we should explore next. There are always more stories hiding behind ordinary facades. Thank you for staying with this one to the end.